Check the description of this video for timestamps to different parts of the video. In the following videos, we're going to be learning how to make dies for 3D printing your own masters. Basically going through everything from preparing the font file that you're going to use, a sort of prefab file, to the actual numbers, and then how to export to be able to use them in Box or Lightyear Slicer. Now, you're going to need a version of Blender that's at least 2.8. This tutorial should work perfectly for both 2.8, 81, 82, 83, or 2.9. I haven't tested in the 2.91 beta, but I think it should work just fine. Now, the first thing you're going to need is to make sure that you're on the standard Blender settings, because if you aren't, there might be discrepancies between like your hotkeys and the ones I use. That could make this tutorial very hard to follow for you. Besides that, once you have your Blender install open, you're gonna head to Preferences in Edit. Go to Add-ons, and you're going to want to enable several of the add-ons included with Blender. That is, Add Mesh Extra Objects, 3D Print Toolbox, Modifier Tools, F2, which is as it sounds, F2, TinyCut Mesh Tools, this one, Align Tools, and Interface 3D Viewport menus. Several of these might not be used, but they are good to have in case you need to use them at some point. But generally, it's just good to have the same ones I'm going to use, as they're helpful when working in the dies. Now, you need one more add-on, which is not included with Blender. It's Advanced Boolean Tool, which you will have to download from Gumroad or another website. I will leave a link on the description. It's a free add-on. You just have to download the zip file and then click on install over here, navigate to your zip file, and then enable the add-on in this list. Now, with that done, I'm going to go ahead and show you a little bit how coordinates and, well, not coordinates, but object transforms work in Blender, right? When you're working in Blender, every object has its own, hold on, I'm going to scale this down a lot. Every object in Blender has its own coordinates that are defined by a set of axes, a local transform, right? Now, you see that the empty I made moves with the cube. That empty represents the local axis of the cube. So, as I add an object, when you add an object in Blender, it will be lined up with the global axis, those you see there. Hold on, I'm going to at the z-axis. So you see the empty, which represents the transform of the cube, is lined up with the local axis. So as long as I don't rotate the cube, it will have the same axis as the global file, the global scene, right? But if I rotate the cube around, say, its y-axis, the x and z axis change, right? They rotate with the cube, and the origin point where all three axes have its origin also moves with the cube, right? So if I have another object, I can actually move along the axis of this cube, right? So if I add, for example, well, the cube itself, I can change to local coordinates, and now I can move it along its own z or x axis, and the y, of course, which is the same as global. And I can also move it in global. That is, oh, wrong key. That is the main idea behind being able to change the transform orientations. Now, if you notice here, there's a couple more. There's normal. What normal does is when you have a plane, like this face of the cube, if you're in global, you can move it along those axes, you know, the global axis. And if you're in local, you can move it along the local axis of the cube, right? But if you're in normal, you can actually move the, hold on, let me rotate. And for example, this, you can now move along the normal of the face. The normal, as you should know if you did any geometry in high school, is the perpendicular, the vector that's perpendicular to a plane, right, in 3D space. So normal is a set of axes defined by a vector that's perpendicular to the face you have selected, right? That's important to know because Blender allows you to create transform orientations, right? The way transform orientations work is whatever you have selected, it doesn't matter. As long as you're inside edit mode and choose a face, for example, this one, if you create a new transform orientation, then you can have a new object. Let's put it on that face. You can have a different object, say sphere 2.005. You can move it along the normal of that face, right? So you have transform orientation, a set of axes that's defined by that face. That means you can align things much easier and move things relative to the faces of your dice when you get to that point. Something that's useful to know is you can also change the pivot point, which is, well, it's pretty self-explanatory. It's the point around which things rotate or scale relative to. So if I scale this cube like it is right now, it scales relative to its origin. If I change the 3D cursor, it will scale from the 3D cursor. Now, I showed you scale, but it also serves to rotate, which is something we're going to use a lot. And we have individual origins, which allows you to rotate. Let's say you have these like this, and you can rotate stuff around its own axis at the same time. You can also scale them. So if you say this were two numbers in two different faces and you wanted to scale them but without changing the depths, right, you would go scale shift C to only moving the X and Y of each one, and you can do it like that, right? So that allows you to work on the local coordinates of different objects at the same time. You would have to go to local here. Now, you don't know how I'm doing different operations like scale, rotate, and others. I'm gonna go ahead and show you the different keys that you're going to be using a lot, right? The sort of basic operations in Blender. So first of all, with Shift S, you open this pie menu that gives you access to the cursor. So you can move selection to cursor, cursor to selected, cursor to active. Difference between selected and active is if you have, for example, two objects and you have two of them selected, one of them, or well, more, as long as you have more than one of them will be yellow and the other ones will be orange. The yellow one is the selected, the active object. Everything else is just selected. So cursor to selected, assuming you have median point, it moves to the median point between the two or more objects. You do cursor to active, it moves to the yellow, to the active object, right? Besides that, you also have cursor to world origin, which will move, well, to world origin. If I have a couple of things here and I put my cursor over there, right? If I use do selection to cursor, it puts them both in the same place. If I do selection to cursor keep offset, it chooses the median point to move them both, right? That's useful to know. And well, besides that, with G, you move around. With R, you rotate. With S, you scale. And all of these operations can be done along the different axes of whatever transform you have chosen. by simply tapping X, Y, or Z after tapping the appropriate key, right? So if you tap key, you move like this, but if you then tap X, you move along the X-axis. If you tap it again a second time, it will change to local. If you are in local, it will change to global, and so on. You can do along any of the axes, and using shift you can lock an axis. So if you want to move along the X and Y, but you don't want to move along the Z axis, you can lock the Z axis with shift Z and move along X and Y only. That also works for scaling, so if you don't want to scale in the Z axis, you can do it like that. And that works for pretty much everything. Besides that, when you are in edit mode, which is accessed through tab in your keyboard, you can use E to extrude a face, which will, by default, it will snap to the normal of the face when you're moving it. Same other keybinds apply, scale, everything. And with 1, 2, and 3 on the numbers at the top of your keyboard, you can change between selecting vertices, edges, or faces. With Shift Z, you change between wireframe or solid view. The final simple keybind that you should know about is the way to change to orthographic view, to different orthographic views when editing. So when you tap on numpad 1, you will change to front view, 3 is for side view, 7 is for top view, and 9 will invert whatever view you have. That should be all you need to know about the basics of Blender when working for this. There's a few more things like selecting, but you shouldn't have a problem with that, I assume. Assuming you have the standard keybinds, you rotate the camera with the scroll wheel, you right click to open a context menu, you select with left click, which will by default be box select, but can be changed tapping W. This will be a sort of circle select, lasso select, and this will be just moving automatically, and then just changing back to box select. You can also do that by just holding on this. And that's pretty much everything. If you have used Blender before, but you haven't used it with the add-ons I recommended, keep in mind that some things, like for example, selecting things with A will be different. In normal Blender, you tap A to select everything, but with the pie menus, you open this pie menu when you hold A, right? The way pie menus work is simply hold the key to keep it open, move the mouse in the direction of the thing you want to do, and then let go of the key. That will choose whatever you want. There's also, you can also click to do something, and also there's sub menus sometimes, so keep that in mind. Oh, and the detail I forgot to mention, with pretty much every operation except extruding, right click on the mouse will cancel the operation. Left click will confirm it. So if you're moving something and you left click, it will stay there. If you're moving something and you right click, it will come back to the point it was. You can also move and scale things with your numbers. You can type in the amount of millimeters that you want to move or scale something. Now, on to preparing your file, your default file for making your dice. Well, pretty much anything that you're going to need for this. So you will have a default file that has a default cube and a camera and a light point, right? So you're going to select all and you're going to delete with X. Then you're gonna go to the scene properties over here on the right. You're gonna change to metric, 0.01 scale, and millimeters. You're gonna want to save those options here in defaults, save startup file. That will make sure that every time you open a new file in Blender, it will look like this. It will be an empty file. it won't have the C here. But it will be an empty file with the scale set to 0.01 and millimeters, which means that if you have anything here, it will be measured in millimeters and you will be able to operate in millimeters. That is really useful when you're trying to make dies. Now, as for the actual prefab file that you're going to use for your font, you're gonna wanna make a collection in the file. I have a bunch here because this is my prefab file already. But you're gonna make a new collection in the outliner and you're gonna name it for your file, right? For your font, whatever font name you want, right? I'm just not gonna do that because I already have some that I'm gonna use in the next few steps. I'm only gonna make some examples here, right? So this process that I'm gonna show you works with text, but if you skip the text part, I will let you know at which point. You can actually do it with an SVG that you can import from outside, right? So if you have an SVG, you can come over here and just choose import SVG, choose whatever SVG you're going to use, and it imports, right? I'll show you at which point you use that later on. Let's assume you have a font file, no OTF or TTF file. So for that, you're going to go Shift A and add text, a text object. You're going to put all of your numbers here, but with a space between each. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. All of the numbers that you're going to use. I'm only going to put 1, 2, 0, 0, and 10, for example, right? So at this stage, you should go over to here, regular, and search for whatever font you plan to use, and you just choose it, and it changes to that font, right? It's that simple. With that, you already have your font prepared, and the next step is you're gonna turn the resolution up to the max possible, 64, and you're going to convert it to a mesh. Now, after you convert to a mesh, you're gonna want to simplify the geometry, because if you select your object, you're gonna see that it has a lot of vertices, right? And while that's not really a problem, it can actually mess up when you're doing booleans, and it can just generally make your Blender slower if you're not on a really high-end computer. So you select your font, you go select all, you choose limited dissolve, and then you, just in case, merge by distance. Now, limited dissolve, what it does is it creates the smallest amount of vertices and faces possible. So if you have something like this where everything is in the same plane, it will just create n-gons, which is polygons with more than 4 vertices, using an angle that you're gonna give it here. So if you change to 1 here, it will keep the necessary higher detail in any detailed parts or curved areas, while it will simplify the more straight areas, like for example this straight line here, will get rid of any unnecessary vertex. Right, so that's good for keeping the high level of detail where you want it and getting rid of unnecessary geometry where you don't need it. Now, after that, what you do is, just still in edit mode, you merge by distance, right? What merge by distance does is a lot of the time you're not gonna do anything with it, but it's a just in case tool for whenever you have two vertices in the same spot. So if I select this vertex here and I extrude, but then I cancel, what that does is it doesn't cancel the extrude, it only leaves the extruded point on the same one as the other, right? So that's still there, and that's your vertex there, and you're not gonna notice. That can ruin your geometry and give you a headache trying to figure out what's wrong with your dies when they aren't like coming out well when you try to print them. And what merge by distance does, it chooses, well, you have to select everything. It chooses the it selects all of the vertices that are closer to each other than a certain threshold, and it merges them, so you don't have any separate vertices. I mean, any duplicate vertices, right? So with that, your geometry is finished. If it's still too much geometry for you, remember you can use perform unlimited dissolve and just turn up the threshold angle. I've done most fonts with 5 degrees and it's worked perfectly. The loss in detail is so minimal, you're not really gonna perceive it. And any actual like detail and any more complex fonts will be preserved because you're not really gonna find details that will be erased with a 5-degree threshold, right? So after that, you have your geometry ready, right? But you need to extrude your numbers and you need to make sure that your normals are fine. So one more note about geometry is that you will see that there's some seemingly unnecessary lines here on the zeros. These lines are because in Blender, n-gons, well, any polygon really in Blender, can't have a hole inside. So you need to have it divided into 2 different polygons, right? So this way, if I go here, faces, you see that it doesn't really have a hole in it, right? So that's needed for all of your zeros and 8s and 6s and so on, right? It will always be like this. It's not a problem, you don't have to worry about it. Now, after you have your geometry prepared, you're going to select everything and you're going to extrude it. So the way you do that is you just tap E while you have everything selected, and you then type in the amount of millimeters that you want to extrude. So what you're gonna want is twice the depth that you want in your numbers, right? So if you want your numbers to be 0.8 millimeters deep, you're gonna want to extrude 1.6 millimeters. And it really is just typing 1.6 and then hitting enter. That will give you this geometry. Now, if I go here and turn on the face orientation, you'll see that it's all blue. That means that the normals are aiming outside, which is a good thing. It's how you want your normals to be. But if I go back a few steps, at this step, if you were to accidentally extrude down with a minus 1.6, you'll see that your normals are all messed up, right? And this might happen accidentally when you're working on stuff, and it's always good to check your normals like that with face orientation. And if you have this, the way to fix it is to just go into edit mode, select all, and then tap Shift M. That will recalculate your normals on the outside of your meshes. That will fix any problems you have with normals. Now, what you want to do next is you're gonna go in here in edit mode and you're gonna go to separate. You can also hit P and you're gonna separate by loose parts. Now, you will have a lot of parts here, right? You're gonna have from 1 to 20 and then to 100, right? So you're gonna be renaming and joining the numbers. Now, I'm just gonna show you how to do it, and then you will have to do it for all of your numbers, right? So for all of the numbers that are 2 digits, you're gonna choose both of them, both digits, and do Control plus J. That will join them as a single mesh. And you're gonna do that for all of your 2-digit numbers. Then you need to rename them. So for that, you're gonna tap F2 on each one of them and type, for example, this is a Matura font, so I'm gonna do Mat1, right? You go for each number to type the name. Make sure it's something you can recognize easily. Oh, that's not speak. Because you're going to be using several fonts, I assume, right? So when you add more and more fonts, it will become harder and harder to look for the numbers that you want to use when making the dice. So it's good to have them with a name you can easily recognize, right? So never call them just 1, 2, 3, whatever. Call them like your font name 1, your font name 2, your font name 100, you know? Now after that, you need one more step to finish your font file. You're gonna switch into top view, although it's not strictly necessary. You're going to select each number, tab into edit view, and make sure that you have your bounding box center selected, right? That's very important. Then you're gonna select all, Shift S, cursor to selected, tab out of edit view, set origin to 3D cursor, and you're gonna wanna do that for every single one of your numbers, right? You're gonna have to do it to every single number. I know it's tedious, but it's necessary. Make sure you save your file. You should have something similar to this. You might not have added the underscore to a number. If you haven't, you're still in time to just manually do all of the process again just for that number. But you can also, if say you didn't have the underscore in the 6 and 9, you can also simply make sure your cursor is on that number. You're gonna add a cube, scale it way down, like 0.001. Then you just move it down. Let's switch to top view. Move it down and place it roughly wherever it is that it should be. Scale it on the y-axis, then scale it on the x-axis, and then switch to front view and scale it on the z-axis until it's roughly the same height as your number. And then you just click there and you join it. That's all there is to making a dash if you haven't done it before. You can do the same thing with an icosphere or UV sphere. Let's make it even smaller. You just type, for example, GX 3 millimeters there and GY minus 3 millimeters there, and you have it placed relative to it, right? So you're gonna want that. You might also want to have a 6 and 9 without the underscore and a 6 and 9 with the underscore. For example, for the D6, which doesn't really make sense having an underscore there, right? So you can just copy your 6 if you have it with the underscore, go over the underscore and type L to choose all of those vertices and you delete those, and you have your 6 without an underscore. So that's pretty much all you need. Make sure that all of your geometry is well placed and everything. Check your normals with the face orientation and so on. Now, when you're confident everything is fine, which if you followed the tutorial, it should be perfect. Just make sure you save, Control S, save, and go on to the next part, which is gonna be making the dice and numbering them.